We're just days away from reaching 1,000 subscribers. If we hit this goal in the next 15 days, we'll be able to keep the channel running and continue bringing you these stories. Your subscription makes all the difference. It's quick and helps us enormously. A Mother's Sacrifice. Chapter 1. The Desperate Decision. London, winter, 1853. Snow fell in thick flakes on the cobbled streets of Whitechapel, transforming the squalid poverty into a deceptive landscape of white innocence. In a miserable room on the third floor of a dilapidated building, Margaret Thornton held her 3 sleeping children close, listening to their weak, wheezing breaths. Thomas, her eldest son at 8 years old, had developed a terrible cough that worsened each day. Little Sarah, 6, had been burning with fever for a week, and baby William, barely 18 months, refused to eat and cried constantly. Margaret knew what this meant. She had seen too many children in the neighborhood carried away by illness and malnutrition. Her children were dying, and she was powerless to save them. At 26, Margaret had the appearance of a 40-year-old woman, widowed for 6 months since her husband Robert died in an accident at the docks. She struggled desperately to keep her family alive with the few pence she earned washing laundry for wealthier families. But it wasn't enough. Never enough. She looked around their single room, a mattress on the bare floor, a rickety table, a bucket of ice-cold water, and the few rags they had left. The landlord would come tomorrow, demanding the rent she couldn't pay. They would be thrown into the street, and with the harsh winter, her children wouldn't survive a night outside. Margaret made a decision that broke her heart. The next morning, she dressed her children in their cleanest clothes, which didn't mean much, and took them to the wealthy quarters of London. Her destination, Grosvenor Square, where the richest and most influential families in the capital lived. "Mama, where are we going?" asked Thomas in his little hoarse voice. "We're going to see beautiful houses, my darling," Margaret replied, trying to keep her tone light despite the anguish knotting her stomach. Sarah clung to her skirt, still weak from her recent fever, while Margaret carried William, who seemed so fragile in her thin arms. Arriving at Grosvenor Square, Margaret stopped before the most imposing of the mansions, Blackthorn House, London residence of the Duke of Ravenswood. She had heard of this man, Adrian Blackthorn, 5th Duke of Ravenswood, one of the richest men in England, but also reputed for his coldness and isolation since his wife's death 5 years earlier. Margaret knew she had only one chance. Just one. She knocked on the service door with courage she drew from her maternal desperation. A servant in impeccable livery opened the door and looked at her with disdain. "What do you want? No beggars here." "Please," said Margaret, maintaining her dignity despite her desperate situation, "I need to speak to the Duke. It's about my children." "The Duke doesn't receive people of your sort," the servant replied with contempt. "Go away before I call the police." But Margaret didn't move. "My children are dying," she said in a clear voice that carried into the house. "I ask nothing for myself, only for them." It was at that moment that a deep voice resonated from inside. "Henderson, what's happening?" The Duke of Ravenswood appeared in the doorway, a tall and imposing man in his 30s, with black hair and piercing grey eyes. He looked at Margaret and her children with an unreadable expression. "Your Grace," stammered Henderson, "this woman claims she wants to speak to you. I told her that." "Let me speak to her," said the Duke calmly. Adrian Blackthorn studied the small group before him. He saw a young woman, despite the exhaustion marking her features, holding a visibly sick baby, flanked by 2 children who had that characteristic thinness of those who don't eat enough. But what struck him most was the pride with which this woman held herself upright, despite her evident distress. "What do you want?" he asked directly. Margaret took a deep breath. Your Grace, my children are sick, and we have nowhere left to go. I don't come to beg. I come to make you a proposition. Adrian raised an eyebrow. What proposition? Take my children, said Margaret in a voice that trembled only imperceptibly. Raise them, educate them, give them the life they deserve. In exchange, I will work for you without salary until my death. I'll do anything, clean, cook, wash. My children will live, and you'll have a devoted servant for life. The silence that followed this declaration was deafening. Henderson looked at Margaret as if she had lost her mind, while the Duke stared at her with troubling intensity. You want to abandon your children? Asked Adrian. I want to save them, Margaret corrected firmly. If they stay with me, they'll die before winter's end. If you take them, they'll live. It's the only gift I can give them. Thomas, who had listened to the exchange, clung to his mother's skirt. Mamma, are you going to leave us? Margaret knelt at her son's height, tears in her eyes, but her voice firm. Thomas, you're going to live in a beautiful castle with your sister and little brother. You'll have food every day, warm clothes, and you'll learn to read and write. But you, Mama, Mama will be. Mama will always be there to love you, said Margaret, embracing him. Adrian observed this scene with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. This woman was ready to sacrifice her maternal happiness to ensure her children's survival. It was an act of love so pure, so selfless, that he was moved. Madam, he began. Thornton, Margaret Thornton. Mrs. Thornton, your proposition is unusual. It's desperate, Margaret admitted, but it's all I have to offer. Adrian looked again at the three children. Thomas was coughing weakly. Sarah was shivering with cold despite her worn shawl, and baby William was moaning softly in his mother's arms. An idea began to germinate in his mind. An idea that would change this family's life in ways Margaret could never have imagined. Mrs. Thornton, he said finally, I accept your proposition, but not exactly as you understand it. Margaret looked at him with hope mixed with apprehension. I have a counter-proposition for you, continued Adrian, a proposition that could save not only your children, but your entire family. Chapter 2. The Counter-Proposition. Margaret looked at the Duke with a mixture of hope and mistrust. In her experience, when the rich made counter-propositions to the poor, it was rarely to the latter's advantage. What counter-proposition, Your Grace? Adrian glanced at Henderson, who was watching them with evident curiosity. Come inside first. It's too cold to continue this conversation outside. Margaret hesitated. Crossing the threshold of this aristocratic mansion with her children in rags seemed sacrilegious. But William was moaning louder and louder, and she felt Sarah trembling against her. Come, Adrian insisted in a gentler tone. Your children need warmth. He led them to a small salon near the entrance, a room that, even if it was considered modest by ducal standards, was more luxurious than anything Margaret had ever seen. A fire crackled in the marble fireplace, and the warmth immediately enveloped the small group. Henderson, said Adrian, ask Mrs. Cooper to prepare hot milk and biscuits for the children, and have her send for Dr. Morrison immediately. Your Grace. Henderson frowned, visibly disconcerted by these orders concerning such unconventional visitors. Immediately, Henderson, Adrian repeated with an authority that brooked no discussion. After the butler's departure, Adrian knelt before Margaret's children, getting down to their level with a patience that surprised their mother. What are your names? He asked Thomas. Thomas Thornton, sir, the boy replied politely despite his cough. And you? Adrian asked Sarah, who was hiding behind her mother. Sarah, the little girl whispered, and this little fellow? Adrian smiled as he looked at William, who had calmed down in the room's warmth. William, said Margaret. He's 18 months old. 3 beautiful children, said Adrian, standing up. Mrs. Thornton, allow me to be direct. Your children are indeed ill, but it's nothing that can't be cured with good care, nutritious food, and a healthy environment. Margaret nodded, not daring to hope where this conversation was leading. You offer me your services in exchange for their lives, continued Adrian. But let me ask you a question. What would you do if I offered you something better? What, Your Grace? Adrian went to the window, looking at the snow-covered gardens of his property. Mrs. Thornton, since my wife's death, this house has become a mausoleum. I live here alone, surrounded by servants who perform their tasks in deathly silence. There's no laughter, no life, no joy. He turned toward her, and Margaret was surprised to see vulnerability in his grey eyes. Your children could change that, he said simply. I don't understand. Mrs. Thornton, my proposition is this. You and your children come to live here, at Blackthorn House, not as servants, but as family. Margaret looked at him as if he were speaking a foreign language. Family? I'm 34 years old and have no heir, no hope of having one for that matter. My lands and fortune will go to a distant cousin who's only interested in squandering the family inheritance. Adrian approached her, his expression becoming more intense. Allow me to legally adopt your sons as my heirs. Thomas will become the future Duke of Ravenswood. William will be his brother and have a courtesy title. Sarah will be raised as a lady, with all the advantages that implies. Margaret felt her legs give way and had to sit in the nearest armchair. You want to make my children your heirs. And you, Mrs. Thornton, will not be a servant. You will be the chatelaine of this house, their mother who ensures they grow up with the love and values that only a true mother can give. But why? Whispered Margaret. Why would you do this for strangers? Adrian looked at Thomas, who had fallen asleep by the fire, his little hand in Sarah's. William was sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms for the first time in weeks. Because, he said softly, I saw a mother ready to sacrifice her own happiness to save her children. That reveals character, nobility of soul that all hereditary titles cannot give. Your children have been raised with this nobility. They deserve the chance to cultivate it. Margaret shook her head, overwhelmed. Your Grace, this is impossible. Society, your peers, they'll never accept. Society can go to hell, said Adrian with a vehemence that made her start. Forgive my language, but I'm tired of conventions. I've lived according to their rules for years, and it has brought me nothing but solitude and bitterness. At that moment, Mrs. Cooper, the cook, entered with a tray of hot milk and biscuits, followed by Dr. Morrison, an elderly man with a kind face. Ah, Doctor, said Adrian, thank you for coming so quickly. These children need a medical examination. Doctor, Morrison looked at Margaret and her children with professional curiosity rather than social judgment, which immediately reassured Margaret. Of course, Your Grace. May I? With Margaret's permission, the doctor examined each child. Thomas with his persistent cough, Sarah still weak from her fever, and little William. Nothing serious, he announced finally. Malnutrition, exhaustion, and what we commonly call diseases of poverty. With good care, adequate nutrition, and a warm, dry environment, these children will be completely recovered in a few weeks. Perfect, said Adrian with satisfaction. Doctor, may I count on your discretion concerning this situation? Naturally, Your Grace. May I say it's refreshing to see someone act according to their conscience rather than conventions. After the doctor's departure, Margaret turned to Adrian, tears in her eyes. Your Grace, even if your proposition is incredibly generous, I cannot accept it. Why? Because it wouldn't be fair to you. You deserve real heirs, a real family. Mrs. Thornton, Adrian interrupted, look at your children. Margaret looked at Thomas and Sarah, who were eating their first real meals in weeks, their faces already less gaunt in the room's warmth. "They are already my real family," said Adrian simply. "The question is, do you accept to become mine?" Margaret closed her eyes, overwhelmed by emotion. When she reopened them, she saw in the Duke's eyes something she had never thought to see there: vulnerability, hope, and perhaps even nascent paternal love. "If I accept," she said slowly, "what do you expect from me in return?" "That you remain their mother," Adrian replied, "that you raise them with the values that make you the courageous woman you are, and perhaps you'll help me become human again." Margaret looked one last time at her children, then at the Duke, who was offering her the impossible. "Your Grace," she said, extending her trembling hand, "I accept your proposition, but on one condition." "Which one?" "Promise me that if you ever regret this decision, you'll tell me honestly. I don't want my children to grow up where they're not truly wanted." Adrian took her hand in his and squeezed it firmly. "Mrs. Thornton, I promise you that day will never come. Your children have just saved my life as much as I've saved theirs." Chapter 3. The Transformation. 3 months had passed since the Thornton family's arrival at Blackthorn House, and the transformation was so remarkable that Adrian sometimes had trouble believing it was the same mansion. Thomas's laughter echoed through the corridors as he ran with his new tutor, Mr. Whitman, a patient young man who had discovered in the boy a sharp intelligence and an extraordinary thirst for learning. Sarah chirped joyfully while taking her piano lessons with Miss Davies, and little William, now flourishing and rosy with health, toddled everywhere, babbling happily. But the most spectacular transformation was that of Margaret herself. Properly nourished, dressed in simple but elegant gowns that Adrian had insisted on having made, and freed from the constant stress of daily survival, Margaret had regained her natural beauty. At 26, she again looked her age, with shining chestnut hair and hazel eyes that sparkled with life. More importantly, she had found her place in the complex hierarchy of the ducal household. The servants, initially skeptical of this intruder from the lower class, had quickly learned to respect her intelligence, her natural dignity, and above all, her evident devotion to the children and the Duke himself. "Mrs. Thornton," said Henderson one morning, finding her in the music room where Sarah was taking her lesson, "His Grace wishes to see you in the library when you have a moment." "Of course, Henderson. Tell him I'll be there in a few minutes." Margaret had learned to navigate the protocol of the aristocratic household, but her relationship with Adrian had become something unique, neither that of a servant with her master, nor that of a guest, but something more familial and more intimate. She found him in the library, bent over official documents spread on his desk. "You wanted to see me, Your Grace?" "Adrian," he corrected automatically. Over the past months, he had insisted she use his first name in private. "And yes, I have something important to show you." He handed her several sealed documents. Margaret examined them with perplexity. They seemed official, with legal seals. "What are these?" "The adoption papers," said Adrian with a smile. "Thomas and William are now legally my sons and heirs. Sarah is my adoptive daughter and will have a dowry worthy of a duchess when she's of age to marry." Margaret felt her legs weaken and had to sit down. It's really done? It's legal?" "Perfectly legal. Thomas Thornton is now Lord Thomas Blackthorn, future Duke of Ravenswood. William is the Honourable William Blackthorn, and Sarah will be Lady Sarah Blackthorn." Tears flowed down Margaret's cheeks. "I don't know how to thank you." "There's more," said Adrian, taking out another document. "I also had this prepared." Margaret read the document with wide eyes. "A will? But why are you showing me? Because you're mentioned in it, explained Adrian. In addition to provisions for the children, I've created a trust fund that will ensure you a comfortable income for the rest of your life. Whatever happens, you'll never fall back into poverty. Adrian, this is too much. I don't deserve. Margaret, said Adrian, standing and approaching her, may I tell you something? She nodded, too moved to speak. These 3 months have been the happiest of my life since Elizabeth's death. This house was dead, and your children have resurrected it, but more than that. He hesitated, seeming to search for his words. More than that. You've reminded me what it meant to be a family, seeing Thomas proudly tell me about his Latin lessons, watching Sarah dance around the salon singing, carrying William when he takes his first steps. It's a happiness I thought I'd never know. Margaret looked at him with new understanding. You never had children with your wife. Adrian shook his head. Elizabeth and I, our marriage was arranged. We respected each other, but there was no true love between us. She died in a horse accident 3 years after our marriage, and I found myself alone with a title, a fortune, but no purpose in life. And now? Now, I wake up every morning hearing your children's laughter. I plan their education, their future. I care about something greater than myself. He stopped in front of her, looking at her with an intensity that made Margaret's heart beat faster. Margaret, may I ask you a personal question? Of course. Were you happy in marriage with your late husband? Margaret thought about her answer. Robert was a good man. He loved the children and worked hard for us, but there wasn't this deep understanding between us. We were partners in survival, more than spouses in love. Adrian nodded. I understand. It was similar with Elizabeth. A comfortable silence settled between them, charged with a new and troubling tension. Adrian, said Margaret finally, may I ask you something? Anything. Do you ever regret your decision, taking in a family of poor people under your roof? Adrian looked at her with surprise. Never. Why that question? Because sometimes when I see you with the children, when I see how they already adore you, I'm afraid it's too good to last. I'm afraid of waking up and discovering that all this was a dream. Adrian knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. Margaret, look at me. This is not a dream. Your children are my children now, legally, emotionally, completely. And you. He stopped, seeming to struggle with himself. And me? You have become essential to this house, to these children, to me. Margaret felt her heart swell with an emotion she had never felt before. Not the respectful affection she had borne for Robert, but something deeper, more troubling. Adrian. I know, he said, standing up. I know it's complicated. Your position here, the social differences, what people will say. That's not what worries me, Margaret interrupted. What is it then? Margaret stood up too, looking him straight in the eyes. I'm afraid of falling in love with you, she said with an honesty that surprised them both. I'm afraid of confusing gratitude with affection, recognition with love, and I'm afraid you might do the same. Adrian looked at her for a long time, then smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him. And what if it wasn't confusion? What if it was simply the right time, the right people, the right circumstances? And if that were the case, whispered Margaret, then, said Adrian, approaching her, we might have the chance to create something wonderful, not just a family by adoption, but a real family, united by love. As they stood there, in the library of Blackthorn House, surrounded by the muffled silence of their new life, Margaret and Adrian understood they were about to cross a line that would forever transform their practical arrangement into something much more precious and profound. Chapter 4. Triumphant Love. 6 months later, Blackthorn House had become the happiest home in all of London. What had begun as an act of compassion had transformed into something neither Adrian nor Margaret had dared to hope, a family united not only by circumstances, but by deep and authentic love. Adrian and Margaret's wedding had taken place 3 months earlier, in the castle's private chapel, in the presence of the children and a few close friends. Margaret had officially become the Duchess of Ravenswood, and her children now legally bore the Blackthorn name. "Mama! Papa! Adrian!" Thomas ran toward them in the grand salon, followed by Sarah, who was laughing heartily. At 9 now, Thomas had grown and gained confidence, but he kept that warm spontaneity that had immediately won over Adrian. "Look what Mr. Whitman taught us." Sarah, now 7 years old, had become an accomplished little lady, but she had retained her natural joy of living. They proudly showed their writing exercises and drawings, their little faces radiant with happiness and health. The contrast with the thin, sick children Adrian had met a year earlier was striking. "It's magnificent," said Margaret, embracing them. "You're both progressing so quickly." Little William, now 2.5 years old, toddled toward them, babbling joyfully. Adrian lifted him in his arms with that natural ease that had so surprised Margaret at first. This austere duke, who had become the most tender father in the world. "And our little man, what have you done today?" asked Adrian, flying William in the air, provoking giggles of joy. "Horse! Horse!" cried William, his new favourite word. "We'll go see the horses tomorrow," Adrian promised. "But first, Papa and Mama need to tell you something important." Margaret and Adrian exchanged a knowing glance. They had news to announce to the children, news that would make their happiness perfect. "Children," said Margaret, sitting down to be at their level, "how do you feel here, at Blackthorn House?" "It's our home," declared Thomas with pride. "Papa Adrian says I'll be a duke someday." "And I'll be a real lady," added Sarah, curtsying, which made them all laugh. "And what if we told you that our family is going to grow even more?" asked Adrian with a mysterious smile. Thomas frowned. "How?" Margaret took a deep breath. "Children, you're going to have a little brother or sister." The silence that followed was brief, replaced by exclamations of joy. "A baby!" cried Sarah, jumping up and down. "A real baby!" "Will it be a boy or a girl?" asked Thomas, with the practical curiosity of a future duke. "We won't know until the birth," Adrian explained. "But boy or girl, it will be your brother or sister, and you'll have to help raise it." "I'll teach him to ride horses," declared Thomas, "and I'll sing lullabies to her," added Sarah. William, who didn't understand everything but felt the general excitement, clapped while laughing. That evening, after putting the children to bed, Margaret and Adrian found themselves in their private salon, savouring the tranquility and their happiness. "Do you think they really understood?" asked Margaret, her hand resting on her still flat belly. "Thomas knows exactly what it means," smiled Adrian. "He asked me yesterday if the baby would also be his heir, in case something happened to me." "And what did you answer?" "That all our children will be equal in my heart, but that he'll remain my principal heir." He seemed relieved to know his future responsibilities were clear. Margaret snuggled against Adrian, still amazed by the journey they had travelled since that desperate day when she had knocked on his door. "Adrian, will you promise me that we'll tell the truth to this baby someday? About his brothers and sister, about me, about how we met?" "Of course," said Adrian, stroking her hair. "But what truth will we tell him?" "That his mama was so poor she was ready to abandon her children to save them, and that his papa was wise enough to save the whole family instead of separating it. And that, from this meeting, was born the most beautiful love story imaginable," added Adrian, kissing her tenderly. "Do you think society has finally accepted us?" asked Margaret. Their marriage had indeed caused scandal in certain circles, but Adrian's evident generosity and the grace with which Margaret had assumed her role as Duchess had eventually won the respect even of their detractors. "My dear," said Adrian, laughing, Did you see Lady Pemberton yesterday at the Ashworth ball? She complimented you on Thomas and Sarah's education. She who had said I'd gone mad marrying a woman of the people. Children have this way of disarming even the most snobbish, observed Margaret. Thomas charms all our guests with his intelligence. Sarah enchants everyone with her music. And William melts all hearts. And their mother, said Adrian, looking at her with that tenderness that still took her breath away. Their mother has become the most respected duchess in London, not for her title, but for her true nobility of heart. Later that night, lying in their bed, Margaret and Adrian talked about the future, their plans for the children, the legacy they were building together. Adrian, whispered Margaret in the darkness, do you remember what you told me the first day? That my children could help you become human again? I remember perfectly. Was it true? Adrian thought about his answer. Yes and no. Your children reminded me of the joy of living. But you, Margaret, you taught me something more precious. What? You taught me that it's never too late to build a real family, that love can be born from the most improbable circumstances, and that sometimes saving someone else means saving yourself. Margaret turned in his arms, her heart swelling with emotion. Do you know what's most wonderful about all this? Tell me. Our children will never remember being poor or hungry. For them, this life, this family is normal. They'll grow up knowing they are loved unconditionally. And our baby will be born in this house, in this family, never knowing anything but love and security, added Adrian. As they fell asleep in each other's arms, Margaret and Adrian knew they had created something rare and precious, a family born not from chance or convention, but from a conscious choice to love and support each other. The desperate act of a mother ready to do anything to save her children had allowed a lonely duke to discover that true happiness was not found in wealth or power, but in the love of a real family. And this family, built on sacrifice, compassion, and love, would become one of the happiest and most united in all Victorian England. Epilogue: The Legacy of Love. 15 years later, Ravenswood Castle still echoed with laughter and joy. Thomas, now 24, had become an accomplished young duke, respected for his intelligence and compassion. Sarah, 22, had married a count who adored her and was already mother to 2 children. William, 17, was studying at Oxford and showed a passion for medicine that would one day lead him to revolutionize care for the poor. The 3 younger children of Adrian and Margaret, Elizabeth 13, Alexander 11, and little Victoria 8, had grown up in the love and security that their older siblings had brought to this family. The story of the Duchess of Ravenswood, former destitute widow who became one of the most respected women in England, had become legendary. But for those who knew the true story, it was above all proof that true love can be born in the most improbable circumstances and create lasting miracles. For Margaret had wanted to save her children, and Adrian had decided to save the whole family. In that decision, they had both found the most complete happiness they had ever known.